So our first speaker tonight is Tchividjian. He's known as Boz affectionately. He is the founder of GRACE, which is an acronym for Godly Response for Abuse in the Christian Environment. He's also the founder of Boz Law PA, where he is a nationally known advocate for victims of all forms of spiritual and sexual abuse. He is a well-known, sought-after speaker, and he's also a personal friend, and he just happens to be the grandson of Billy Graham, and he is just a wonderful brother in the Lord, a man that I just have so much respect for, and I'm so excited that he's here tonight. So can we welcome Boz Tchividjian tonight?
Thank you. Okay, he said I had it 2.5 hours, so I want to make sure I put that. Is that right? 2.5 hours? Okay, perfect. Okay. After about 10 minutes, you're going to be like, okay, maybe you should just have 5 minutes. Anyway, but I am going to turn on my timer for 45 minutes, because otherwise, us lawyers like to go on and on and on, especially if you're a jury. But you're not a jury, so I'll do my best. Well, I appreciate the invite to be here. We all have our own life's journey, and that brings us to this place. But the one consistent thread is our Heavenly Father. And so it's just a privilege to be here and to meet new people and to be encouraged that God's never asleep, right? He's always active, and this is an example of that. So let me tell you a little bit about Sarah. Sarah is 15. Sarah and her family go to church. We'll just call it Memorial Baptist Church. I don't think there's probably is a Memorial Baptist Church. This is a hypothetical. Maybe. No, I'm just kidding. They've been going to that church for many years. It's their church home. It's their community. It's their family. Everybody knows Sarah. Everybody knows her parents. She has a sibling. And as Sarah gets older, she's really excited because she wants to get involved with a youth group. Because every kid in the church, when they get to a certain age, they're sort of chomping at the bit to go to youth group. So she does. And she loves youth group. And there's a youth pastor. Let's call him Bobby. And Bobby's been there for a few years, and he's beloved by everybody. But Bobby is now moving on to another church. And the church ultimately hires a guy named Tom. And Tom is pretty cool. Tom's probably 28, 29, married, little baby. Wife is cool, hangs out with the kids too. And he's a good youth pastor. In fact, everybody loves him. Sarah doesn't really get to know Tom real well, but they do go on a youth trip, a mission trip one summer down to the Caribbean. And during that mission trip, about 10 or 12 youth go, and Tom goes. And as they're down there, she gets to know Tom a little bit. He starts asking her a little bit about herself and about her life, and she's like, this is really cool that her youth pastor is interested in her. In fact, probably she feels like, her dad's been real busy at work. Her mom's busy raising her siblings. And it's really neat to have this pastor, Tom, spending time talking with her, asking her about what's going on in her life. As any teenage girl, say she was 15, lots is going on. So as they're down in the mission trip, she comes back from that trip really connected now to the youth group, primarily because she's connected with Tom. Then one day, Tom is talking to her, and she opens up a little bit. This is after youth group as they're talking. She opens up a little bit of some of the struggles she's having with her parents. Dad's at work all the time. She and mom are sort of going at it a little bit. And Tom thanks her for sharing that with her. And in the process, Tom just sort of mentions that sometimes he has struggles with his wife. She thought, wow, that's pretty cool. He shared something with me. So that connection grew. And again, Sarah thinks this is wonderful. She's never been more excited about church in her life. And she's actually finding herself reading her Bible more. Well, one day, after a Wednesday night youth group, again, she's talking to Tom. And she says something about not being able to make it to next week. And he goes, why? He goes, well, we've got a car in the shop and my dad's going to be out of town. I just don't have a way. He goes, well, we can pick you up. And she goes, you would do that? Yeah. That'd be awesome. The next week, she's thinking Tom and his wife are going to pick her up. It's just Tom. Tells her the wife had to stay home. One of the kids is sick. Doesn't think much of it. They get in the car and they drive to church. And as they're driving to the church, again, these conversations start up. How's the stuff going on with your parents? Yeah, my wife and I got in an argument this morning. Well, why? Well, she's real busy with the kids. See, everybody has problems at home. She's really feeling connected. Well, from that day forward, he starts picking her up at home, bringing her to church, bringing her back. And then one day she tried to get in touch with him. She couldn't, and she told him that when she finally got to youth group. And he said, well, here's my phone number. Why don't you just text me? Or we can use something else, but you can just text me. So she did. When she needed to be picked up, she texts him. Great, picks her up. But then about a week later, on a Tuesday night, she gets a text from Tom. How's it going? Just checking how things are going at the house. Good. How's your parents? Okay. Yeah, my wife and I, we got a little argument again today, but I think we're going to be okay. Okay, Tom, I'm really connecting more and more. Well, one Wednesday after youth group, he's going to bring her home, and he says, you want to stop and get some ice cream? And she goes, sure. They stop and get some ice cream. Again, youth pastor with a youth. He's ministering to her. Well, there's a woman in the church as she's driving home from work. She's driving through downtown, and she sees Tom and Sarah. Did I say Sarah or Sally? I can't remember the name. Sarah. Am I right with Sarah? Okay. Because if I start saying Sally, now it's really going to confuse you. You're like, where'd this person come? So Sarah. She sees Sarah and Tom eating at the ice cream. And something just doesn't sit right with her. But she's like, I'm seeing things. No, let me not be so judgmental. Let me just leave it alone. Well, pretty soon, it becomes a habit after youth group. Hey, he texted her earlier in the day. Why don't we go to get ice cream after youth group? She starts looking forward to that time. Ice cream with her youth pastor. Some of her friends are like, why are you going to get ice cream with him? Can we go? No, he's bringing me home. He's going to stop on the way home. Well, this woman again is driving through town the next week and she sees this. Now she's a little concerned. She's like, that just doesn't sit right. But again, she convinces herself, he's a youth pastor. He must have been vetted. He's trusted. He must be doing his job. Well, the following week, they go get ice cream, and then Tom says, hey, let's go across the street to the park to talk. Now it's getting dusk. They start talking, start opening up again and more about problems. And Tom tells Sarah during that time, for the very first time, you look really cute tonight. Well, this woman's driving through town again, coming home from work, and now she sees that. And finally she says, I think I've got to do something. I don't know what to do. So she gets home, she tells her husband, I don't know what I should be doing. He says, well, call the pastor. She says, that's a good idea. So she calls the pastor. The pastor's wife answers the phone, says, I just want to tell you what I'm seeing. Last few weeks I've driven through town. Youth pastor is with this girl, Sarah. They're eating ice cream. It may be nothing, but then this week I drove through town. They're at a park across the street having ice cream and talking. They seem to be very close as they're talking. And the pastor's wife said, I'm sure it's nothing. I wouldn't worry about it. He's well vetted. He's obviously discipling her. I'll mention it to the pastor, but we got it. Okay. Problem is, the next week, drives by and still in the park, talking. And the communication between Tom and Sarah now is increasing to the point where he says, maybe we shouldn't use texting. He goes, have you ever heard of, maybe we do Facebook Messenger, or have you ever heard of Signal? Signal, after you text, it disappears. Okay, that might be good. Because then we don't have to delete stuff. Not that we're doing anything wrong, but maybe we should start using that. Okay. start doing that. Well, one day she gets a text on a Wednesday before youth group, and they had a guest speaker that night for youth group, and so he didn't have to go. He says, hey, how about I pick you up and we go somewhere? And again, this is her youth pastor, and she says, okay. She comes by, picks her up, and he ends up about 5 miles away at a motel. And it's on that night that Tom first initiates sexual contact with Sarah. She's confused. She doesn't know what to think. This is her pastor. She really trusts him. She's gotten to know him. He knows her secrets. She knows some of his. And this sexual contact continues. In fact, it intensifies. And the communications intensify. The sexualized communications intensify. To the point where one day, Sarah left her phone at home when she went to school. And mom hears it buzzing. She picks it up and she looks, and it's from Tom. And it's a message I wouldn't share with you because it was so perverse. The mom's world comes to a screeching halt. What is going on? She immediately calls her husband. They go right to the school, pull Sarah out. What is this? What's going on? Sarah immediately becomes very defensive because she's in love with Tom. She's 15. She thinks she's in love with Tom. And her parents say, what has been happening? We've gone through your phone. We've read about the meetings at the hotels. We're going to report this. So the father first just calls the pastor. Pastor, what's going on? We're going to report this. Pastor says, I don't know what's going on. Let me talk to you. Don't report it just yet. Let's talk about this. Sarah doesn't want anybody reporting anything. She doesn't even talk about it. She's in love with Tom. Well, we don't have enough time to go into it, but long story short, father finally does report it, even after the pastor said, hey, let's just take care of it inside the church. We don't want to hurt the reputation of this church. And quite frankly, we don't want to stain the reputation of Jesus by letting this get out. And father was very conflicted by that because, well, he's the pastor. He does have a point. Everybody seems to be against the church nowadays, so this is just going to fuel that. But at the end of the day, his fatherly, God-given instincts propel him to go, no. What Tom did with my daughter is a crime. And he calls police. Now, eventually Sarah, with some therapy, begins to realize what was happening and the disparity of power and how Tom exploited and abused that power to target and groom and ultimately sexually victimize her. And that comes with a lot of pretty intense therapy. And she's got a long road ahead of her because this impacts every aspect of her life. Every relationship she has, her relationship with God. This man represented God to her. This man told her that God thought this was good. Completely distorted everything. It's going to take her a lifetime of healing. So Tom ultimately gets prosecuted. But then Sarah, she's getting this therapy. The parents aren't well-off people. And they go, man, this is expensive. And somebody one day on the side says, well, why don't you have the church pay for it? Well, that's a good point. So call the church. Pastor says, well, we'll pay for a couple sessions. That's it? Yeah, that's all we can do. That doesn't sit well with him. And somebody finally said, why don't you go see a lawyer? A lawyer? Why? What do you mean? I'm going to sue the church? I don't know, but you better find out what your rights are. So a lot of his friends are like, you're a Christian. You shouldn't be going to sue the lawyer. You shouldn't sue other Christians. Don't do that. But he decides again to follow his God-given fatherly instincts, and they go meet with a lawyer. And the lawyer hears the story, and the lawyer says, well, how long is Sarah going to need therapy? Well, her therapist says, you don't know. She's going to need it for a long time, for a period, and then she might be okay, but then when she gets a boyfriend or gets engaged, she's going to have more issues, and when she has kids, this is something she's going to be processing for a very long time. I don't know. Well, how are you going to pay for that? I don't know. We barely make ends meet now. Well, if you ask the church to pay for it, yeah, they paid for a couple sessions. That's it? Yeah, that's it. Well, let's see if we can change that. And ultimately, the lawyer sends the church a letter that says, you know what? You were put on notice about Tom. You were put on notice 2 or 3 times by somebody from your church who saw something that bothered them, so much so that they came home and called you. And your response was, it's probably not a big deal, trust us. And you did nothing. And had you done something, this child may have never been sexually victimized by your youth pastor. So you're going to be held accountable. And ultimately that happens. The church is sued. They contact their insurance carrier. And that's just a side note. Most churches have insurance. So most churches, very few churches, there's some, are shut down because of these types of lawsuits because they've got insurance. And the ones that don't, oh well. But ultimately through that process, what happens? Not only is Sarah able to be compensated not to go buy a sports car, which if she wants, I don't care. That's her money. But she's be compensated so she can put money away so that she can get this help and therapy that she's going to need throughout her lifetime. And more importantly than the money is the fact that for so long, something was taken from her. A person took his power and exploited it over her and took something from her time and time again. And through the process with this case, she actually was empowered. She actually was being able to reclaim some power and make decisions about what to do with the case, when to move forward with the case, when to try to resolve the case. But it's always will affect her for the rest of her life that this happened in a church. It didn't happen in a Mormon church, a Jehovah's Witness church. This was a Baptist church because it happens here. It happens inside of our churches. I don't care who you are. There's no boundaries. But that's Sarah. Let me tell you about Stephanie. Stephanie is a 35-year-old mom, 2 kids. Husband's a corrections officer. Works hard. Christian family. They attend a little Lutheran church in a small town in the Midwest. But they struggle. They struggle financially. Stephanie's mom died a year or 2 earlier. She's really been struggling with that. Husband doesn't really connect with her and helping her with that. And they have some relational issues, struggling. Well, Stephanie's church gets a new pastor. His name's Alan, and everybody loves Alan. This is a church that was desperately in need for a pastor for a year, and they finally got somebody. And this guy, Alan, he captivates everybody's attention. He's the life of the party. He's charismatic, articulate, great preacher. And Alan's married, and Alan first meets Stephanie and her husband, and at the introduction to the pastor night and the new pastor, they talk, and this is great. They finally got this pastor. A couple weeks later, Alan says, hey, do you all want to come over for dinner? Sure. Who doesn't want to go over to your pastor's house for dinner? It's great. Should be a great thing. So they go over and have a wonderful time. Get to know the family, get to know Alan's wife, get to know the kids. And in the course of the conversation that dinner, Stephanie or her husband said something about times are tough economically. They're trying to work really hard. They go out to dinner a few more times and really see Alan and his wife as not only a pastor, but new friends. And then one night they're out to dinner and Alan says, Stephanie, we have a part-time position at the church opening up. Oh, really? Yeah, and I know you guys have talked about you're financially struggling, and maybe this will help. And it's a known environment. It's a church. We'd love to have you. Please consider applying. She goes home. They talk about it. She goes, I think this could be an answer to prayer. Like, I get to go work at our church, help financially. So she does. And for the first weeks, it's wonderful. Gets to see Alan, gets to see some of the other people. It's a small church. A couple days a week when she's working, it's only Alan there. Alan stops by, says hi. They talk a little bit. He goes into his study. Well, over time, those stopping by and say hi takes a little longer. Now Alan doesn't have to compete with husband because Alan is just there with her alone. And one day she's had a hard morning and she comes in and looks like she'd been crying, and he asks, you've been crying? What's going on? And she says, we're just really struggling. My marriage is struggling. My kids are really a problem. And he says, well, come, let's talk about it. And he says, I think we should just meet once a week for a couple hours for some pastoral counseling. Her pastor, it's Alan, well-beloved, well-trusted. So they start meeting. And during those meetings, she begins to open up to the point where she's really sharing struggles in her relationship with her husband. To the point one day, Alan makes a comment, if you were my wife, I'd never treat you that way. He shouldn't do that. Well, as odd as it may sound for some of us sitting here, that was really helpful for her to hear at the moment. She felt like for the first time heard and affirmed. She liked that. And he knew it. And then one day as they're having their pastoral counseling sessions, Alan opens up about his own struggles. He's got a temper. He and his wife struggle. And then one day he says, we even struggle intimately. She goes, really? Yeah. She feels a little awkward with that, so she doesn't say anything. And by the end of that session, he says, well, can we hug? They hug. A little awkward, but, nothing. Again, it's pastor. Well, fast forward. This goes on. The meetings continue. The hugs increase. Now the comments begin. You look really cute today. I really like the dress you're wearing. She hasn't heard comments like that from her husband in years. This is her pastor, her employer, her spiritual leader, her counselor. You see, all mushed into one person. Dangerous. And one day as they're finishing a meeting and he's asking her for a hug, Alan reaches over and kisses her. And this was the beginning of a year-long sexual contact between Alan and Stephanie. Now you'll notice I don't say the word relationship because I don't think it is one. It's abuse. Alan was a pastor, spiritual authority, greater degree of power, and he used that position to target her, to separate her, to groom her, and to victimize her. And it's not until months later, a year later, her world's imploding because she realizes this is not right. But when she begins to really say something to Alan about this, Alan says, well, you're just as guilty as I am in all this. Now the shame begins to build. How dare if I say anything? I'm going to ruin this man's ministry. I'll be out. Even to the point one day he said, listen, it's up to you. I'm so attracted to you. It's your responsibility to keep me from doing anything to you. Because I need you to exercise that discipline. So now she's got that on her shoulders. Like, I got to do that. Well, needless to say, this imploded. Somebody learned about it. She steps forward. She discloses. Alan gets up in front of the church, cries, talks about how he made a mistake. It was an adulterous relationship. Little church is really shocked because they really wanted Alan because they hadn't had a pastor for a long time. And now look at this. And now guess who they're really upset with? Alan? Nope. Stephanie. She ruined it for them. Within days, she loses her community. Now, Alan eventually gets removed, but the church body still feels bad for him. In fact, actually, they feel more sorry for his wife than they do for Stephanie. Stephanie also comes to me because somebody said, you should go see a lawyer. She's, again, same issue, struggling financially. She needs help. Marriage is really imploding. And so what do? Well, we learned that Alan had come from a number of other churches, moved them around. And I know this comes as a shock, but guess what? Had he done this before? Yep. But most of the time, people just looked at this as sort of he commits adultery, which is bad. But the gospel is all about forgiveness and God's grace. So we need to forgive him and restore him. It's all about restoration. Alan thrives in that type of environment because that's what offenders do. They exploit the beliefs that we hold so precious. But we also can be pretty naive. Because when somebody in a position like that as a pastor uses that position to abuse somebody else with less power, they should never be in that position again. Ever. Ever. In the state that I was handling this case, it was a crime. So Alan was prosecuted, and the denomination was sued because they put him in that spot. And Stephanie was able to be, again, compensated to get help. But that's not what it was all about. It was about Stephanie coming to the realization that she didn't need to hide behind her shame anymore. That she was a victim. And that she needed help. And that she needed to reclaim, again, what had been taken from her. And that process helped tremendously. Stephanie's still married. They go to church, but occasionally. Certainly don't go to that church. But they're going to make it. Alan's in prison. That's a whole other story for another time. So why do I bring all this up? I bring this up because this is prevalent. I spend day in, day out for the last 30 years of my life dealing with issues just like I shared with you. All inside the evangelical church, not the Catholic Church, not the Mormon Church, not the Jehovah's Witness. Oh, it all exists there too. We all know that. This is in primarily the conservative evangelical church. It's an epidemic. And so when I hear people in churches, and the churches I attend, so critical about those out there, sometimes I bite my tongue, sometimes I don't. Because I go, man, I've spent the last 30 years moving towards remember the parable of the Good Samaritan? There are people lined up inside of our churches and outside, laying on the side of our roadways that we are walking by, that we've put there as a church, and that we've ignored. I want to read you something real quick. We're not going to have enough time for this because I don't want Al to pull me down with, like he said, I think he was going to attack us or something, but something like that. But I want to read you from, most of you might be familiar with this, 2 Samuel. David's son Absalom had a beautiful unmarried sister named Tamar. Amnon, another of David's sons, fell in love with her. He was so much in love with her that he became sick because it seemed impossible for him to have her. As a virgin, she was kept from meeting men. But he had a friend, a very shrewd man named Jonadab, the son of David's brother Shammah. Jonadab said to Amnon, "You're the king's son. Yet day after day I see you looking sad. What's the matter?" "I'm in love with Tamar, the sister of my half-brother, Absalom," he answered. Jonadab said to him, "Pretend that you're sick and go to bed. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please ask my sister Tamar to come and feed me. I want her to fix the food here where I can see her, and then serve it to me herself.'" So Amnon pretended that he was sick and went to bed. King David went to see him, and Amnon said to him, "Please let Tamar come and make a few cakes here where I can see her, and then serve them to me herself." So David sent word to Tamar in the palace, "Go to Amnon's house and fix him some food." She went there and found him in bed. She took some dough, prepared it, made him some cakes there where he could see her. Then she baked the cakes and emptied them out of the pan for him to eat, but he wouldn't. He said, "Send everyone away." They all left. Then he said to her, "Bring the cakes here to my bed and serve them to me yourself." She took the cakes and went over to him. As she offered them to him, he grabbed her and said, "Come to bed with me." "No," she said. "Don't force me to do such a degrading thing. That's awful. How could I ever hold up my head in public again? And you would be completely disgraced in Israel. Please speak to the king, and I'm sure that he will give me to you." But he would not listen to her, and since he was stronger than she was, he overpowered her and he raped her. Then Amnon was filled with deep hatred for her. He hated her now even more than he had ever loved her before. He said, "Get out." "No," she said. "To send me away like this is a greater crime than what you just did." But Amnon would not listen to her. He called in as a personal servant and said, "Get this woman out of my sight. Throw her out and lock the door." The servant put her out and locked the door. Tamar was wearing a long robe with full sleeves, the usual clothing for an unmarried princess in those days. She sprinkled ashes on her head, tore her robe, and with her face buried in her hands, went away crying. When Absalom, her brother, saw her, he said, "Has Amnon molested you? Please, sister, don't let it upset you so much. He is your half-brother, so don't tell anybody about it." So Tamar lived in Absalom's house, sad and lonely. When King David heard what had happened, he was furious. And Absalom hated Amnon so much for having raped his sister Tamar that he would no longer even speak to him. I want to quickly, in the last few minutes, I want to look at some common dynamics of abuse that we see in this passage that we still see today. Just a few. One, abusers are almost always known and respected members of society. We always think of child abusers or even adult assaulters as the sort of the creepy people in the outlying areas. That's just not my experience. A friend told me one time, it's not the creepy guy sitting at the party you have to worry about, it's the host. There's a lot of truth to that statement. Amnon was a prince in the land, privileged, powerful son of David. Tom was a dynamic youth pastor. Alan, well-beloved pastor. Abusers use their power to target, isolate, abuse, and silence their victims. Amnon used his power and influence to convince the king to send Tamar. Tom used his influence to get Sarah alone. And Alan used his influence as a pastor to convince Stephanie to come work at the church. Abusers want what they want and do what they need to do to get it. Despite the reality that there were boundaries preventing him from abusing Tamar, what does Amnon do? He crafts a plan with his friend. He's not going to give up. He's persistent. Most offenders are persistent. They're cunning. They're thinking about this all the time. They're thinking about it way more than you and I. That's why they're usually 5 steps ahead of us, sometimes even further. Abusers deceive and manipulate others who could protect victims. The plan involves, in Amnon, deceiving not only Tamar, but David and the rest of the royal household as to what is going on. Tom deceived Sarah's family. He's picking her up for youth group. Alan deceived Stephanie and her family. He's offering her a job. How kind. Abusers may gain access to the vulnerable in an isolated situation. The deception that he is sick allows Amnon to lure her to a private, isolated room. Alan is able to isolate Stephanie by giving her a job at the church. Tom is able to isolate Sarah by picking her up and developing this youth pastor relationship. Abusers violently exploit their physical power over the weak. He overpowers Tamar despite her protests. Now listen, sexual assault is not always about necessarily physically overpowering. Alan didn't do that with Stephanie. Alan groomed her to the point where she almost had no ability to say no. And sometimes people struggle with that. Because they say, well, you could have done something. You need to understand and study more about what grooming does, especially when you're grooming a vulnerable person and you're exploiting those vulnerabilities. Abusers act with callous arrogance and treat victims as disposable objects, just like Amnon did with Tamar. Abusers and others minimize their actions. Amnon instructs the ward to lock her out and take her away as if nothing wrong had occurred. Abusers devastate their victims. Tamar's traumatized, and the trauma affects her for the rest of her life. I mean, think about it. What do we know about her? The rest of Scripture. Tamar, she lived in Absalom's house, sad and lonely. Isn't that tragic? We just gloss over those words. Think about it. For the rest of her life, she was sad and lonely. Another way to say it was traumatized. A life destroyed. And abusers and those around them silence their victims. Look at this, Absalom. What does he say? Did he molest you? Well, don't say anything about it. David? One day I am going to ask God a little bit about David being God saying David's a man after my own heart. Because, David, I know he messed up like all of us, but, David sometimes really irritates me. And here's one scenario he really does. Because what does he do? What does he do? Nothing. He gets furious. No action. If I could count how many times pastors and religious leaders express with their words, this is terrible. I'm furious about this. This should have never happened. And don't do anything. And when we say, well, then can you help compensate this person to get the help? Well, you have to talk to our lawyer or talk to our insurance carrier. Well, I know, but they actually will take some guidance from you if you talk to them, and they don't. David does nothing. Those who we think will be the biggest advocates for the abused are often the ones who remain silent and do nothing. That's been my experience. And sometimes it's the people you least expect who actually stand up and go, excuse me, this is not right. Something needs to be done. Now, what did Jesus say about protecting the vulnerable from abusers? Matthew 18, 5 and 6. Christ identifies himself with humble and vulnerable children. To receive a child in the name of Jesus is what? To receive Jesus. If you think about that, you realize that if you believe that Jesus is the God of the universe, the God of the universe says, if you receive one of these little ones, you receive me? But in how many of our churches and religious communities that we've grown up in are we told that children are to be seen and not heard? There's nothing godly about that comment. Certainly not the way Jesus lived. What does he say about those who cause a child to stumble? I mean, it's one of the few times Jesus talked pretty violently, right? Putting a millstone around your neck and throwing you in the sea. It's not a way I hope to die, though it's probably fast, I would think. It's hard to imagine any more serious words from Jesus on our sacred responsibility to protect children and vulnerable people. And then in Mark 10, Jesus places children firmly at the center of God's purposes and kingdom. And what happens in that passage? Jesus is talking and the children come up, and who gets upset? The disciples get upset. The ones closest to Jesus, the ones that you would think would mirror the character of Jesus most because they're with him day in and day out. What do? They get upset. How dare those kids are getting in the way of the sermon or whatever. And what does Jesus do? Yeah, you're right. No, Jesus is really ticked off with his disciples because they interrupted kids approaching him. When we don't protect kids and vulnerable people, when we don't respond well when they come to us and disclose this, we are not receiving them well. We are preventing them from coming to Jesus. We are not mirroring the character of God. And we're not being obedient. But words aren't enough for Jesus. Words are not enough for Jesus. Jesus takes action. Throughout Scripture, vulnerable people are given special attention by Jesus, aren't they? The widow, the orphan, the poor, the disabled, children, immigrants, and those oppressed by demons. Those are the people Jesus moved towards. I think sometimes in our church we've somewhat forgotten that. Yeah, those people are sort of ministry objectives. So we're going to help the orphans and this, but no, it's got to be part of our DNA. Are we moving towards that demographic? Is protecting children and vulnerable people in our church part of the very DNA of who we are at the church? Because if it's not, then it's not, I don't know what you're doing. That's the very basic. That's the basic response of being a Christian. Is valuing those who God values and loves. Jesus was always interacting with the rejected. He was always moving away from the crowds towards those who were alienated and left out. I can tell you that so many of my cases where an adult or a child comes forward having been abused inside the church, one of the most tragic aspects of all of that, besides the abuse, is that when this person steps forward, they believe that the church will be their greatest advocate. And 9 out of 10 of them are outside of that church within 2 months. Lost community, no more church family, alone, isolated, and feeling incredibly betrayed. It's not right. The church should have been their greatest advocate. Instead, so often it turns their back. I talked to a client one day that her daughter had been molested by a youth leader. They brought it forward. They thought it was going to go well. I said, well, okay. I mean, I hope it does, but you'll be calling me in about 2 months. Sure enough, about 6 weeks later, they called. But she said, I was in Target the other day and I ran into a woman that I'd been in my church. We were in home fellowship group together. Our kids grew up together and we caught each other's eyes and I was about to say something and she looked at me, turned around and walked the other way. Because her daughter was molested, she now loses community. There's something upside down about that. There's something actually quite evil about that, if you think about it. It doesn't reflect the character of Jesus. God cares about justice for all, but he knows that the vulnerable are less likely to get justice in this world. The vulnerable are more easily preyed upon by those with power. God promises judgment for those who oppress the vulnerable. Just a few verses in Amos, the Lord says, the people of Israel have sinned again and again, and for this I will certainly punish them. They sell into slavery honest people who cannot pay their debts, the poor who cannot repay even the price of a pair of sandals. They trample down the weak and helpless and push the poor out of the way. And God's saying, the God of the universe is saying, I'm punishing them. Isaiah 1. Stop all this evil that I see you doing. Yes, stop doing evil and learn to do right. See that justice is done. Help those who are oppressed. Give orphans their rights and defend widows. And one other is Zechariah. Long ago I gave these commands to my people. You must see that justice is done and must show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress widows, orphans, foreigners who live among you, or anyone else in need, and do not plan ways of harming one another. People, these are the words of God. This is the God that we claim that we love and we worship. And if we claim that we love and worship this God, then we would want to not only hear his words, but follow them. Mirror them in our lives. Let the world see inside and out of our churches there's something different about that group of people. They are moving towards the oppressed. They are moving towards the outcast. And they're doing everything they can to protect the vulnerable within their midst. Because that's the way of Jesus. And then in closing, I would just say, our hope is in Christ. And what do I mean by that? I don't want me to be trite like our hope is in Christ and we can end my presentation. I mean that in a substantive way. Because God's incarnation as one who was wounded, marginalized, and oppressed. God stepped into our world. He moved towards us. He gave himself for us. Are we doing that for those around us? Are we doing that for the children around us? Are we doing that for the vulnerable who surround us everywhere, inside our churches and out? The entire life of Jesus speaks of a deep experience and understanding of maltreatment. Jesus was the descendant of two sexually exploited women, Rahab and Bathsheba. Jesus was nearly a victim of child homicide by King Herod. Jesus was physically abused on the cross. And let's not forget, though, this is the hope, that it was the incarnation of Jesus that made the resurrection possible. And I'll just say this before I leave. I want to read you just two sentences of a letter I got from one of these individuals that I've been sharing about tonight. Because I think it's when we value the marginalized and vulnerable to the point that we step into their lives and that we walk with them and experience their pain, that God will do his greatest work in bringing about new life, in giving them a new story. A person wrote me, they said, I can't type this without tears streaming down. Through my life, I've seen Christian leaders work hard to cover abuses, manipulate, and do all sorts of things in God's name. You have presented such a different picture of God's heart, both in beginning this investigation and also in addressing the termination with wisdom. I don't know exactly what to do with that. You've all been very clear that everything you do for ultimately an audience of one. Each time I start to fear, I remember that, and it's comforting. You see God differently than I was taught to see him. Your view of him dictates your decisions, but your view of him as a God of love who cares for those who are broken. Let's remember that. Thank you.